So hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Are the Military a Threat to Brazilian Democracy Today? My name is Sidney Chalhoub. I'm the David and Peggy Rockefeller Professor of History and of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, and I will be your moderator today. I'm pleased and honored to introduce today's speakers in the order that they will present to us. So Chirio is, oh, I missed the pronunciation, sorry, is Associate Professor of History at the Université Gustave Eiffel in France. Among her work, I'd like to highlight her book, Politics in Uniform, Military Officers and Dictatorship in Brazil, which is particularly relevant to our discussion today. The book is an important study of internal divisions among the military during the dictatorship. João Roberto Martins Filho is a professor at the Federal University of São Carlos, UFSCar. Though João Roberto has written prolifically about the Brazilian dictatorship and military, including O Palácio e a Caserna, the palace and the barracks, a classic in the field, I'd like to mention here a volume that he has recently edited entitled Os Militares e a Crise Brasileira, the Military and the Brazilian Crisis. It is essential reading to understand from different perspectives the return of the military to political meddling in Brazil in the past few years. Well, I invert to the order, right? So it's João Roberto is going to be the last one. And Natalia is going to be second. It's good to start making mistakes. So either you get informal or you get depressed. So, Natalia is going to be the second. Natalia Viana is a co-founder and the executive director of Agência Pública, Brazil's first nonprofit investigative journalism outlet. Natalia is currently a Nieman Fellow at Harvard and recently published the book Dano Colateral, a Intervenção dos Militares em Segurança Pública, in English, Collateral Damage, the Military Intervention in Public Security. The expression collateral damage in the title is both a reference to the victims of military operations among the Black and poor and the weakening of the country's democracy as one of the consequences of these operations. So it's really exciting to host you three today to talk about such an important and worrisome topic. So thank you very much for agreeing to be with us. So we will record today's webinar, and it will be published on the Dr. Class YouTube channel in the coming weeks. We'll also email a link of the recording to all who registered. So we hope to see you at other events that we host at the David Rockefeller Center for American Studies. In the chat, we've added links to our online calendar as well as social media channels. I encourage you all to follow us there for the most up-to-date information on upcoming events. We'd love to hear from you during today's event. If you have a question for our speakers, please send it through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We will be answering questions at the end of the session, but feel free to submit them at any time. So without further ado, I'd like to begin by welcoming our first guest, Chirio. Please, floor is yours.
Hi everyone. Thank you very much, Sidney, for this invitation and your intense work in preparing the event. And thank you, Thiago, for the perfect organization also. It's always a pleasure to share a roundtable with my dear friend and Professor João. And I'm very happy also to have the opportunity to meet Natalia, even if virtually. As a starting point, I would like to remind how the political changes that Brazil knows for the The 3 or even 5 years have represented a breaking with the future as it was previously imagined by the academics, by the majority of journalists, and by progressive sectors. A breaking with what we can call horizons of expectations about Brazilian politics and social life. These groups in which, even not being a Brazilian citizen, I include myself, always have analyzed the political situation in Brazil using some historical categories. The fall of military regime, the democratic transitions and consolidations, memory wars and victories, and so on. And the use of these categories made almost unthinkable some phenomena, as the rising to the presidency of an extreme right president, nostalgic of the military dictatorship, and the comeback of military at the heart of power. I do believe that the determinist sort of positivist way to the transition to democracy was sought by us as a one-way, irreversible process, has contributed to make invisible some changes or, on the contrary, continuities that affected the military world when they seem to contradict our perception of a consolidated civilian democracy. Despite of lots of contacts between military circles and academics working on defense, for example, within an association called the Associação Brasileira de Estudos de Defesa, Defense Studies Brazil Association, contacts that have been built in order to contribute to the insertion of the armed forces in the democratic regime. Despite of these contacts, the changes within the military institution have not been sufficiently perceived. A key moment, in my opinion, is the end of the 2000s and the beginning of the 2010s. These were the years of the writing of the third national plan for human rights, and the first one that was really ambitious and published in 2009. Years when the National Truth Commission was being thought and established. And this exact moment, the moment when Brazil seemed to be facing its past at last, opening new archives, giving to the world the image of concluding a non-concluding transition, concluded transition to democracy, was also the moment when theories of cultural Marxism entered the army, when the first political insubordinations of military men occurred, when more peacekeeping missions and pacification operations in the urban suburbs and abroad empowered military about their legitimacy and capacities to fight against crime, subversion, and even to govern. I believe there is a concomitance here, and this perfect concomitance influenced our capacity or incapacity to see in the last years the political, administrative, and professional empowerment of large sectors of the official corps. The conscience of this blindness led to the remobilization of part of our intellectual world under the leadership mainly of João Roberto and other colleagues. Our collective work has since been guided by one priority: understand the remilitarization of Brazilian politics in order to fight back. Understand what changes and what continuities have led to the extreme politicization of the armed forces and the remilitarization of Brazilian politics and government. So all the elements that I would like to present here are the product not of an individual reflection or research, but of this collective work. I would like to organize these elements according to one and only question: their historicity. Are there long, medium, or short term more relevant to think this phenomenon? What would be long-term causes for this? I think that all have to do with the historical role of the Brazilian army within the political system as a modernizing corporation at the core of the state, a state in the course of its building. A corporation whose professional identity was built on a complex of superiority among civilian elites, considered as technically as well as morally inferiors. This esprit de corps, not completely compatible with civilian regime, partly explains that civilian supremacy was more an exception than rule since the proclamation of the Brazilian Republic at the end of the 19th century. In other terms, the civilian supremacy during the New Republic was more an exception at the scale of Brazilian history than a rule. A second long-term phenomena closely linked to the first one would be the historical importance of policing functions attributed to the armed forces since the pacifying operations of the 19th century, as well as missions of administering some territories. These missions have clearly been reinforced by the influence of European colonial armies since the 30s of the 20th century, that contributed that the Brazilian military would see its own people as a colonialized population. At the same time, external defense always has been a minor preoccupation for the institution. Besides this long-term professional identity and traditional internal missions, I think we can identify medium-term factors that are more specific of the 20th century and that have to do with how a consolidated state apparel becomes more ambitious in maintaining society under control and getting rid of the factors of dissent and destabilization of social order. In particular, social forces considered as subversive, a place occupied by communism after the Russian Revolution and the great popular mobilizations of the 30s. As the Brazilian armed forces were already in charge of a great part of internal policing, they naturally assumed a leading role in fighting against subversions, especially after the beginning of the Cold War. During this period, counter-subversive doctrines produced by the same old colonial armies that had contributed to train and professionalize the Brazilian army deeply entered the institution. It seems to me that the building of new doctrines of internal security and defense, compatible with democracy and human rights, has never completely been done after that. And that the Cold War counter-subversive doctrines never left the institution, culture, and of the Brazilian army. These doctrines have then been adapted, but not changed in their core to the unipolar world. They have evolved in war against terrorism. Would it be understood as crime, narco-traffic, Islamism, or popular movements considered too radical or carrying a communist project of power? The image of an Occidental world threatened and besieged echoed with new rights theories of cultural Marxism and Gramscian revolution, which intensely circulated in the Americas since the 2000s. So all these Cold War heritages connect with what I think we can call short-term factors, and that's my last point. Under the New Republic, despite of real civilian control and supremacy, the Brazilian armed forces never stopped to be involved in urban security and rescue missions and considered as legitimate and competent to do so. Abroad, they gained and consolidated an image of specialists in peacekeeping operation in poor suburbs, the mission in Haiti being a game changer for the self-image of a world military generation, as Natalia certainly will explain. When the Brazilian democratic crisis broke out in 2013 or 14, it met many military officials who were disposed to read the institutional paralysis and corruption scandals as a predictable failure of the civilian political system, convinced of their own ability to rule and maintain stability and to fight against eternal enemies. They identified to the PT, landless movements, homeless movements, black blocs, and so on. And also convinced that the National Truth Commission that have worked from 2012 to 2014 was not only an affront to the armed institution dignity, an old revenge of the left and the vanquished, but also the proof that there were indeed a project of power on the part of an anti-nationalist and communist front, and that symbolical and memorial victories over the military were part of this project of power. In other terms, and to conclude, the crisis of Brazilian democracy revealed, to my mind, that there still existed within the Brazilian state a quite autonomous institution in which imaginaries of internal war, a complex of superiority over civilians, and the conviction to be more adapted to the modern world than them never stopped to be cultivated. The political and moral crisis in Brazil within the broader crisis of Occidental democracies furnished a perfect breeding ground to renew military ambitions in politics on that basis. And the remobilization of old authoritarian regimes, authoritarian imaginaries, was fueled by a new right offensive, which with its project of moral order and cultural war. All these elements, as I've said in our talk before the meeting, leave too many remaining questions because they're very abstract. They lack more precise temporalities of understanding of who, which generations and groups, when, how, by which means these imaginaries have been mobilized. In other terms, of empirical researches, which only could lighten the parts of old authoritarianism, anti-civilian militarist traditions, and the weight of more recent reactivations in a context of crisis of Occidental democracies. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Maud. So the next speaker is Natalia Viana. Natalia, please.
Thank you, Sidney. Thank you, Professor Maud and Professor João. I am super flattered to be here with you. I'm a mere journalist, not anywhere close to the historians like yourselves. But I think I have some answers to Maud, to the questions she posed. And I think I'm very happy that I asked to be the second, because I think they tie very well together. So the question of this talk is, are the military a threat? To answer these questions, for me, we have to look at the role of the top generals have played in recent key events in Brazil. And as a journalist, I feel it is important to report on facts, which is what I am going to do. Doing the research for my latest book, Dano Colateral, I have it here. I reported on key moments in recent years that have advanced the position of the armed forces, and especially the army, in Brazilian politics. My book argues that this was not organic or unplanned, but the result of conscious decisions made by a group of top generals that revolved around the influential commander of the army, General Eduardo Vilas-Boas, and his lifelong friend and partner, General Sérgio Etchegóin. My book also argues that the main way in which the military regained prominence in the Brazilian public sphere was through their deployment in security operations within the national borders, mainly to combat drug traffickers in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, which received a boost during the left-wing governments of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff. During Lula's governments, Brazilian army started its major deployment in half a century, the Peace Force in Haiti. Over 30,000 Brazilian soldiers went to Haiti during the 13 years of MINUSTA. The commanders, meanwhile, grew to be respected within the force, and many would become active politically in the coming years. Out of the 9 force commanders of MINUSTA, 6 gained strategic posts during the government of Jair Bolsonaro. These are names such as General Santos Cruz, who was Chief Minister of the Secretariat of Government, General Luiz Eduardo Ramos, still a very important minister and a personal friend of Bolsonaro, General Heleno, head of the Institutional Security Office, which heads the Brazilian intelligence, And one of the least criticized ministers in this troubled government, the Minister of Infrastructure, Tarcísio Gomes, also worked in Haiti as a head of the technical section of the engineering battalion. The peace mission in Haiti also marked a shift in the doctrine of internal security. Many commanders, as well as the Defense Minister Nelson Jobim, defended the use of the tactics applied in Haiti to the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. Indeed, when Lula's governments acquiesced to the deployment of military corps ahead of the 2014 World Cup and 2016 Olympics, veterans from Haiti were the first ones to be selected to police the Rio slums. During the governments of Lula, Dilma, and Temer, the deployment of military as police in Brazil exploded. I don't know if you say that, but it became very high numbers. And during the same period, the army grew in influence among politicians and also in influence within the media as sources to be interviewed. But I'm going to focus today on some of the actions taken by General Eduardo Vilas-Boas and his allies. This is because while history is the result of wider social trends, it is also a result of the individual actions by some key characters. Between 2012 and 2014, as Professor Mold has already said, President Dilma Rousseff enacted a National Truth Commission to investigate, register, and bring to light political violence committed during the 21 years of military dictatorship. The commission had no binding power, but it was widely expected to allow closure for the families of the victims of the regime, with at least some collaboration from the armed forces. The result was far from ideal, and I would agree was quite the opposite of what was intended. Even though the 4,000-page report constitutes an undeniable source of historical value, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force did not engage in investigations and later refused to apologize for their role in the dictatorship. As a member of the High Command, General Echegoyen was tasked with mediating the relationship with the Army. He was also the only member of the active forces that criticized openly the report, stating that it was a pathetic effort to rewrite history, in his view, through the eyes of those who were defeated. General Eduardo Vilas-Boas, who would take the command just months later, explained in his memoir the reasoning for the High Command of the Army not to apologize. So I'm going to quote, right? He says, "We studied in detail the development of ongoing processes in Argentina and Chile. From them, we draw two relevant conclusions. The sequence of events in Brazil was repeating what was accomplished in those countries, from indemnities to the revision of the amnesty law and the Truth Commission. In both cases, Chile and Argentina, there were commanders who presented apologies on the assumption that this attitude would be putting an end to the process. But on the contrary, these requests were considered a confession of guilt, prompting the intensification of investigation procedures. Internally, in the respective armies, this seriously affected institutional self-esteem." So the High Command of the Army has decided not to apologize because it would affect their self-esteem. In my book, I argue also that the misogynistic bias against the only female president in history, as well as a vow to act in the name of the father, meaning both their own ancestors who were in the army, many of the generals come from families in the army, and their former commanders played an important role in the support of the generals for Dilma's impeachment in 2016. This is a matter that has to be further investigated by the academy, journalists, and etc. General Vilas-Boas and Echegoyen took part in meetings with the then Vice President Michel Temer during the impeachment procedures. Temer described in his book one of these dinners in the house of Vilas-Boas as an agreeable political conversation. His friend Dennis Rosenfeld describes an ambience of concordance to defend the country. The generals were also in contact with other political leaders during the impeachment procedure. After taking office, Temer used the closeness to the army throughout his government by instituting Etchegóin as a super minister, boosting the intelligence agency under his command, and appointing a general as defense minister for the first time since the creation of the defense ministry, leaving the armed forces free from civilian ministerial command for the first time since the 90s. Temer also authorized a military intervention in Rio de Janeiro, allowing generals to administer a chunk of the government for the first time in a democratic period. Within 2 years, the military would take part in many other issues and administer many other areas, from the production of chloroquine against COVID to administering infrastructure and health. But the intervention in Rio was the first time that they acted as administrators. It was under Temer that the commander of the army threatened the Supreme Court as he was ruling whether the former president Lula should remain in jail on corruption charges. He tweeted that the army repudiated impunity and was attentive to its constitutional mission. As we know, the Supreme Court left Lula out of the race, which led to Jair Bolsonaro, former army captain, to being elected. Vilas Boas was rewarded for his boldness and went on to work for the government, receiving, important to say, 2 salaries. Salary as a retired army general and also salary as a member of the GSE. He is not the only one. 1/4 of Bolsonaro's cabinet are made of military officers, and over 6,000 military men have taken jobs in the administration, which is twice as much as the previous governments. They were involved in murky episodes such as the manufacturing and distribution of chloroquine, an ineffective drug against COVID, and also illegal negotiations to buy vaccines. Despite these scandals, some have felt emboldened to make repeated open threats to the other powers, such as the Supreme Court and the House of Deputies, the Congress. The army has consistently been used by President Bolsonaro to threaten other powers and to threaten democracy. He has stopped to call my army, to call the Brazilian army my army. This shows that, different from the US, some top-level generals do support Bolsonaro's authoritarian attempts. And as a result, Brazilian democracy is hanging on the balance, in which a simple shift in the forces high command and who is in command could change the balance of power and push the military into Bolsonaro's arms. However, my main argument today is not about a coup d'etat or a traditional coup d'etat or a military regime soon to be in Brazil. For me, the advances of the military into politics have already damaged our democracy to a point of no return. This is an existential threat, and not only for Brazil. Large reforms need to be made in Brazil to reframe the role of the military away from internal security and from politics once and for all. The consequences are clear, and they will not go away. We can talk about privileges, such as the fact that the military were largely spared cuts during the pensions reform, even though the retired military account for a very large proportion of the debt in pensions, in which military accounts for 17 times more, a military receives 17 times more expenses in the pensions than a civil servant. We can talk about how our tax money is being used to protect and defend the interests of the military, such as the Advocacia Geral da União, so the General Advocacy of the Union, which has helped cover up for an illegal army operation in Rio that led to the death of musician Eduardo Rosa and collector Luciano Macedo, and who defended that armed forces members should be exempt from a cap in their salaries they worked for the government. And AGU also defended that the armed forces are legally free to deny that there ever existed a military dictatorship in Brazil. This is all that the AGU is doing during this government. But the main legacy, I believe, is the fact that the military are not willing to give up politics in the near future. During the 2018 elections, Villas-Boas invited all presidential candidates to discuss with him the priorities of the army, which would be unthinkable in neighboring countries such as Chile, Argentina, but also in many democracies. This happened, and of course, no one was received more times by Villas-Boas than Bolsonaro. Now the same signs are being seen for the 2022 elections. Lula, who is a very strong candidate, has already made attempts now to reach out to the high command of the army through his former defense minister, Nelson Jobim, according to press reports, and former judge and future candidate Sérgio Moro is also in talks with generals and has invited several well-known generals to the ceremony in which he will be affiliated with the party Podemos. The influence of the military in public life in recent years in Brazil is the result of a group of generals that decided it was time that they stop being the big silent or o grande mudo, but also of the complicity of civilians. The military power has not grown in the void, but counted on the sloppiness of politicians and governments who did not establish and complete the submission of the armed forces to civilian rule. This is what I have to say.
Thank you, Natalia. So last speaker is Professor João Roberto Martins Filho. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of you, and it's a pleasure to participate in this debate with my colleague Maud, and just read the book of Natalia's. So, and Sidney, I knew him from Unicamp, where I studied from 1973 to 1995 in all my graduation. Well, the two presentations saved me some time because I was going to say some of the things they said. But we must keep in mind that this was the Bolsonaro project was a result of a coordinated action of a group of generals that were already mentioned, which graduated at the military academy, Amman, in the years 1974-78, all of them, except for General Heleno, who graduated in 1969. At that time, we had the government of Ernesto Geisel, but when they went to the academy, they had instructors that had just participated in the destruction of the armed groups. So they had this, they came just after the worst years of the repression, but they had the memory that was very, very fresh yet. In my presentation, I would like to begin stressing one event in those years, that the previous years before the election of Bolsonaro. The turning point for me, the game-changing event for me, is the invitation of the then just re-elected Congressman Bolsonaro, former army captain. He was not expelled from the army, but he was, in a certain sense, he did not have anything more to do in the army after he wrote a letter to a magazine in Brazil about the military payments. And after that, he was, Vision said that he was planning to explode bombs in military premises to politicians for this pledge. Bolsonaro, till then, was a persona non grata for those events until he was invited to this graduation at the academy. It was the first time he was accepted at that place. And since he left himself the academy, he was invited to attend the ceremony of graduation. And the context of this visit was, first, Dilma Rousseff has just been re-elected, because this happened on November 2014, and he himself was re-elected for this 60th time, I think. And he was elected generally with 100,000 votes. But in this last election, in 2014, he was elected 400,000 votes, 4 times what he usually had votes in the military family that lives in Rio de Janeiro. And the other thing that gives the context for this invitation is that we were approaching the end of the works of the National Truth Commission, Comissão Nacional da Verdade. And 1 month earlier, as Natalia says, remembers in her book, 27 retired generals published a manifesto against the commission, I would say, and against the Ministry of Defense, and against all the proposals that the military should apologize for what happened in the dictatorship and things like that. So the re-election of Dilma and the approaching of the end of the works of the National Truth Commission, but I'm sure that they have full knowledge of everything that was happening there. I've been there 2 or 3 times, and I gave a talk to the commissioners, as they were, commissaries as they were called. And I remember well that at that time I said that, well, we have we have to advance in the control of the military. And what would they do? I said. And nobody said, well, they can do terrible things. But at that time, we thought that there was the alternative of returning to power was absurd in the end of 2014. But maybe more important than the presence of Bolsonaro in the ceremony was the fact, and there is a video showing this, that he made a brief speech to a group of graduating cadets in the premises of the academy, in which he launched his bid for the presidential elections of October 2018. And he said that on January this year, that I launched my campaign there, my pre-campaign, as he said. He was applauded, he was called leader, and the presence and the speech, they were approved by all the chain of command. For instance, the director of higher education in the army at that time was General Ajax, that will return in my presentation. In my view, I read the book, Natalia's book, and I was just recovering all these facts that we have collected to understand what happened that we did not see. That event was a turning point, not as a sign of the military support for a future candidature of Bolsonaro, because nobody knew that he would be able to win elections. We did not know he was to win the elections in 2018, in the beginning of the 2008. So there is no question of voting for Bolsonaro. But the question is, that was a sign that after the National Truth Commission, the fragile pact that assured the acceptance of democracy by the military was broken. From now on, they would ally even with Devil himself against the left. And that is a point of no return, I think, since that time. And we must remember that at that time, Echegóin was important, but Vilas Boas was not important yet. He was not the commander of the army. He was nominated by Dilma with the support of some of my colleagues. But I did not really take part in any. I live in Campinas and I teach in São Carlos. I'm not near any point of power. So I taught in São Carlos. So I did not support him. Nobody would care if I supported him or not. But I have colleagues that have supported him. He was considered a Democrat, and he really acted as if he was the one we were expecting for commander of the army. And those guys are very clever. Every time we hear what they're saying, we have to keep in mind that they are experts in hiding what they are thinking, especially well, Vilas Boas and also Echegouin. So that idea that something was broken and the enemy was the left, well, it was like a return of the repressed. And this became clear 4 years later when Bolsonaro had as a vice president General Heleno, and they started to participate centrally, but not visibly in the presidential campaign. And I don't think that they were the ones that made Bolsonaro, as some people say. They were not able to make Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was made for a cluster of processes, and they like to say that they had created Bolsonaro. Well, anyway, we have found 2 videos which express the participation that was really, they tried to hide this participation. But one it was a video from General Ajax, the one that I said that was the director of the higher education in the army, in which he said that between the first turn and the runoff, he said that this election is not a common election, because this election is a war between 2 different ideologies. The PT has governed the country and relatively moderate, but now if the PT would return, they will come as with a vengeance, and they will really hurt the army, and they are the enemies of the armed forces now. And the other one was I just received this video 2 or 3 years ago, 2 or 3 days ago. It was from General Santos Cruz. He was also calling out his colleagues to vote for Bolsonaro. For him, Bolsonaro represented democracy and liberty. This is the guy that is seen as the Democrat now. In contrast with his opponent, Haddad, who is a professor of the University of São Paulo, who represented dictatorship, fascism, Nazism, racism, and corruption. Well, this is the idea. I wrote this paper to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, and I called this "In the Name of Ideology." Well, the military government, with the election of Bolsonaro, the first part of the military's project was concluded victoriously. All the generals that directed it, with the exception of Echegouin, were now in the government. And Natalia, one thing that maybe he didn't tell you is that the idea that he had, I knew that by his friends, is that he was expecting to be nominated ambassador to the United States, Echegouin. And Bolsonaro told him that his son would be the new ambassador to the United States. Well, so there was a victory. They were able to find a way to return to power through elections and through popular vote. But in my view, the second part of the plan failed. We have evidence that they always knew that Bolsonaro was very incompetent to this task, to be president of Brazil. Santos Cruz told this to a friend of mine in October or November 2018. And this friend of mine asked him, and who is going to control the crazy guy? And he said, I will. Well, in June 2019, he was dismissed by Bolsonaro. And the other one is a very respectable admiral that he attended a meeting of admirals to organize the support for Bolsonaro. And he said to them, well, the guy is completely incompetent. And they told him that we are going to control him. We're going to civilize him. We're going to educate him. We are going to be in the backstage. Nobody's going to see us, and we can control. And he said, I'm out of it. And I really like this. He was a conservative. He's a conservative admiral. He was center right, but he was able to see that it was not a good idea. And I also think that they are not so intelligent, those generals, because they really put the army in a situation that was really regrettable. The first interview I gave to Intercept, they chose one of my phrases that was, the generals are having really bad moments with Bolsonaro. This 6 months after the election. After Santos Cruz was fired, he began to criticize the president. Now, he said today that Bolsonaro is a populist. Well, and now he's considered an important asset of the third way in 2022, an alternative to Lula and Bolsonaro. As I said to an interview to the site Mongol Bay, it's important to understand that the Bolsonaro government is not a military government, in my view. It's a government leaning towards fascism, and this kind of government has an important factor, that is the personalistic leadership of the president, of the leader, of whoever, and which is supported by the military as it is supported by other factions. I don't believe Bolsonaro is controlled by the military. It is much more ambiguous than that. He needs them and they need him so far. They need him so far. To finish, I'd like to remember of a doctrine that's also attributed to Vilas Boas, and which is not a genius himself. In his interview to Celso Castro, he was talking about the time that he spent in Beijing. And I know the daughter of the ambassador of Brazil at that time, and she wrote a piece about the time she spent there, 16 years old, and it's brilliant, the memories of this woman professor. But what he has to say about the Chinese experience of his and his family, he says it was possible to find ingredients to make a barbecue in Beijing. So from all things he could remember, he remembered that was easy to find meat to have a barbecue in Beijing. But Bolsonaro, Vilas Boas was said to have a doctrine that justified the participation of the military in politics after the National Truth Commission. The first was stability, the second was legality, and the third was legitimacy. Well, in my view, and the first ones, stability and legality, were linked to the idea that the military can be the moderating power in their interpretation of the Article 142 of the Brazilian National Constitution. In my view, stability, legality, and legitimacy are completely out of question in 3 years of what did they get with that three pillars. And how about the future? Just finishing this. Paradoxically, Bolsonaro, even if we don't have a military government, Bolsonaro was able to militarize the government and militarize Brazilian politics in a degree unknown since the military dictatorship. So if he lives, he will let this heritage. They were not able to control him, but now the next president will have to get rid of them. And this is going to be a very difficult question. I know that Lula is worried about that, and he's not talking about this question, and he's hearing to opinions of academics and things that we just said that doesn't work if you try to say that I was very good with the military. They look at you and say you are. That's a proof of weakness. He's trying to be okay with this, and the possibilities of controlling the military will depend on the relation of forces in the next years, if Bolsonaro is not elected, and if, just to finish, they don't come with any secret about Bolsonaro that can destroy Bolsonaro in just one coup, like that Bolsonaro was vaccinated in the years and he always tried to hide this, because they have a lot of information about Bolsonaro and his kids, but it will depend of the. Now we have two candidates. One is this Bolsonaro, the other one is Moro, and Moro is talking to the military to find a companion to his bid to election. Thank you. That's it. Sorry for my English. I'm trying to learn German, and I think that I'm not learning German and I'm forgetting English.
So thank you very much for the presentations. There is a lot to talk about. There are some questions, but maybe I will ask mine questions first, and then group with some of the questions that are already appearing in the Q&A. The questions in the Q&A are basically about the future. And so let me ask a couple of questions about the past. One is this idea about the military as the moderating power. And sometimes they speak as if they have always had the role of mediating or meddling into politics. I want to stress very powerfully as a historian of 19th century Brazil that this is not true, right? I mean, until the end of the empire, there's only one example of an attempt of military, it actually worked as military interference, which is 1868 during the Paraguayan War, in which Caxias actually demanded a change of cabinet. And this was the first moment in which the military really interfered in high politics in Brazil. The generation of independence was hostile to any idea of having a strong, powerful military, right? So this is not a Brazilian tradition in the way it's always been there. It's not true. It was invented by the end of the 19th century. And I think it is very much linked to the Paraguayan War. And this is a related question. It's in the same bunch of things here, which is, I think Natalia's book shows really well how important Haiti and the GLO operations were for the military to gain muscles again, and with all the other factors that you've been mentioning, to interfere in politics again. And, you know, these things are constructed by them as wars, as military operations, and deploying a lot of forces, lots of people, lots of generals. And there is something that you see repeated in history in many places. Strong military deployment results in important changes, and very often in the strengthening of the military politically. It was the case during the Paraguayan War, and although it's not the same dimension, I think, again, this extensive deployment of forces had a very unforeseen consequence for the people who did it, which is strengthening the military and make them feel entitled to more political power. So this is it's kind of two questions in one. So we have, these are questions about the past. I have very interesting questions about the present here. One is, and I've asked these two questions and then I'll ask you comment and then come back to more questions. The first one by André Bottom. He's a PhD candidate at Pública, Rio Grande do Sul, and is at the moment at Vanderbilt University as an extended student. So he'd like to ask Natalia Viana whether this agency of the military in Bolsonaro's government can eventually trigger their intervention in case Bolsonaro loses the election next year. Is that possible? What do you think? There's a related question by Stanley Gathek, who is a senior advisor for Global Strategies United Food and Commercial Workers International Union. He says, how could the currently disproportional and ominous military role and influence in the current Bolsonaro administration directly affect the upcoming October 22 elections? What are the possible concrete scenarios in your estimation? Please be as specific as possible. Is a copy out of the question, or is it really possible? So let's stop here and see what you think about these initial bunch of questions. Who wants to start? Should we follow in this first round of the other presentations and ask Maud to start?
No problem. Thank you, Sidney, for the questions and the public. So your questions about if the military have been in the history of Brazil a moderating power, it has been a political actor since the beginning of the Republic, almost constantly, as counselors, as an actor that played not always as an institution, but as factions and rebels, but it never left the political scene since the proclamation of the Republic. But I think that the idea of moderating power is an invented tradition applied to the 19th century and applied to the 20th century, when it was something much more complicated than a moderating power, just because it was not an entity. It didn't work as an institution. The army worked with diverse interests. There was nationalist groups and internationalist groups and liberal groups and diverse generations that played their role. So the idea of moderating power is an instrument to justify political power now and in other moments of the history, to my mind. I don't have an answer about the consequences of the deployment of military. I agree with you. I think it's an interesting comparison between the Paraguayan War and the operation in the security, urban security operations in the last years. I think that something comes to my mind. I think there is a specificity about the security operations that implied a presence in a territory. That the fact that being a force that had the role to administrate a population and a territory, to control, to have a role of surveillance. This is also a specific factor of having later the feeling that they can deal with the power, they can rule. And it's maybe a little different with the experience of the Paraguayan War that gave them the the impression of a great legitimacy because they were the veterans and they deserve to have a role in the destinies of the country. The question of Stanley about the consequences of the militarization of power on the 2022 elections. Well, we all have insights, but nobody, I think, have an answer. I agree with what João Roberto said about a split in the army, with some military talking to Moro and some military that remain faithful to Bolsonaro, and that will adapt to the evolution of the situation. I think also that what João Roberto said about the fear of revenge on part of the PT if going back to power is very strong. The anti-Petism, I don't know if the word exists in English, but remains absolutely strong, and that there is a rejection of the comeback to power of the left, and also the feeling that it was not going to be only a revenge, but the fear of demilitarization of the government and the state. And this militarization has implications for lots of officials in terms of money, in terms of salaries, in terms of benefits. And they don't want to left power, to left the state, to left the government. And this is going to be a very strong element in the campaign, but I don't know if what are going to be the means to wait on the campaign and to wait on the results of the elections. I always think that an open coup, old-fashioned open coup, is something that's very difficult to assume, and to begin a new regime or begin a new government on the base of an open and military coup. I don't believe in a military coup, but there's lots of other options with intelligence, with the playing the role of a political actor that always have been played by the armed forces. But I'm quite sure they're going to be to do everything in their power to prevent that the PT or anything progressive comes back to power. And maybe they're going to play the card of Moro because Bolsonaro is probably not for the future years a good defensor of the military interests as it had been in the past.
Okay, so Natalia, João, let's see if you want to add things or make more comments about any of the questions. You don't need to answer all of them, but just whatever you want to add to what Maud said.
I also think it's very hard to predict what is going to happen. I do think that the fact that the future candidates are already talking to the military already a very strong indication of what is the role that they're going to play. I also think it's very relevant that like the professor said, there are many very influential generals in the military that decided to join the government and then left for different reasons, and these people are acting politically very strongly. And they still have a lot of influence in the army and also in society. And they are going to make sure that their vision, which also was very well explained as like anti-left, very strong on security, seeing that the PT is going to come back and make the most leftist government in the world. This is all going to be reflected in whatever ticket they decide to join. I also see that there is one thing that if you talk to anybody who favors or is close to the generals who have been in the government, they say, well, at least this government is not corrupt. This is the one thing that they are all very proud of. They say, look at Tarcísio in infrastructure, there's no corruption there, in a ministry that has always been corrupt. So I think they still have hold and will continue to spread the view that, you know, the left as an ingrained political corrupt force. That's why I think many of them can probably flock to Moro. As of a coup d'etat, what I think is that Bolsonaro lost prestige in the army and in the armed forces. It was very clear by the recent, like by when the three commanders decided to quit. This is unprecedented. It's huge. I think it's not just some, you know, just somebody just quitting their jobs. The three commanders of the forces quitting at the same time. This is huge. Also, then you had like the new commander of the Navy and the new commander of the Air Force saying things in support of Bolsonaro, but the commander of the army being quite silent and a little bit, so they are still keeping that line of being away from Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro also stopped saying my army, which is also a sign that some politics are happening there. However, I believe that Bolsonaro, if he is threatened enough, we all know how he acts, you know, he's a paranoid guy. If he's threatened enough, he may want to really try and get rid of the current heads of the military to have closer people in command. And I think that would be a huge threat because, of course, we know that anything can be passed as a security crisis, anything, say a protest or something, could be used as an excuse. I do not think Bolsonaro has the power to do that now. And after, you know, that letter that, by the way, Temer negotiated, it's very important to remember that Temer is still closely allied to some of the, you know, the people who are very close to the army, such as Jungmann. And he negotiated that pact. So I'm just saying that these people are really around, and probably there is a lot of politics doing in the background. I do not think Bolsonaro has the power now. He is going to try and bribe a whole nation with like his own, you know, his own social stipend, and he probably intends to turn the game.
Thank you, Natalia. João Roberto, please.
Well, I'm sure that everybody's wanting an answer to that question of the coup d'etat, so I'll not avoid it. I'll just say same that they have said, that I don't see this as a possibility, and the real question is what to do with the military problem from now on. And this is very clear in the book, on Natalia's book. Dilma made very big mistakes in her. I respect her a lot, but with all that question that the military were able to do something better than the others, and this in the World Cup, in all the events that we have in Brazil, the military were able to control the thing and to put the federal police in the as a second force. And also the Haiti Port-au-Prince Rio connection. That was really, we were deluded by a lot of things, and we cheated ourselves about the question of the return of the military to power, but we saw that connection at the time. It was clear, that connection, because we saw the first time. We thought that maybe it was a good thing to go to Haiti because they could have a modern mission, and they maybe would forget the internal order question. But what they did was to connect one thing to another. And I have friends that have seen those generals going to Congress after they returned to give the report of what they, and they were really feeling very, very important. And the one that was most promoted as a hero, and he was the only Brazilian general that was in a situation of war, was Santos Cruz and his command in Congo. And that, if you look at YouTube, you're going to see videos that were made by the social communication agency of the army, and they were promoting him as the general, the one that was a hero. I really, when I see I would say my friend Celso Mori saying things that he's saying today, I think sometimes he didn't understand, he didn't learn of what happened. Well, they were very nice. They treated me very well. They were very polite, but they were just hiding everything from you. And well, he's so gentleman that he can't see maybe that people can do this with him, but they can. The other question is, some people use the term military party. The military party is when the army mainly acts as a party, united and able to do what they did in 2018. Unity of action, a program, and things like that. But this this notion, when it appeared in the works of what's the name of the professor at the University of São Paulo, and he was the journalist at the Estado de São Paulo, Oliveiros Ferreira. When Oliveiros Ferreira created this notion, that was a notion that was to be applied to critical situations for a short time. If you have the military participating in politics, the natural result of this is that they are going to be divided by politics. So you can't act as a military party for a long time. If this works, you're going to have problems. And so I think that situation now is revealing that the unity they had in 2018 is not going to happen again in 2022. There was only Bolsonaro at that time. Now, Bolsonaro has made everything. Never seen any military saying that he was responsible for 600,000 deaths. They don't like to say this simple. They could say they are in the reserve. They are allowed by law to speak out. And so and there is one other question that's we're going to have lots of military candidates for the election, for governors, for Senate, for the House of Representatives, the Câmara dos Deputados, and maybe a vice president, a candidate for vice president. So the guys came to stay. And I hope that we have a president that can work this. It's not going to be a simple thing, and avoid things like giving them what they want. That's the intelligence. Let's remember that Dilma Rousseff did wrong things, and this is normal in any presidency or leadership, but she extinguished the GSI, former military cabinet of the president. She just extinguished the thing. And when she was impeached, the next president, the vice president, and now President Temer, he recreated it and gave it to Echegoi. So it's not a simple thing. It's going to be hard to clean the mess that they have done.
Thank you. So let's have a last round of questions. We have 3 questions. I'll ask the 3 of them, and then you will answer them as you wish and make your final remarks. Okay? Mm-hmm. So first question by Ernesto Bohoslavsky. Thanks for these three great talks. I'd like to know more about what Professor Chirio has suggested, that Brazilian social sciences are not capable at all to imagine current political negative situation, increasing authoritarianism, growing armist political power within the state, etc. Are social science blind to reality? It seems to be the case related to the surprising Bolsonaro's triumph in 2018, unconscious victims of wishful thinking about the unfilled promises of the Nova República, but it was just impossible to foresee the processes. Thanks. Well, we've been discussing internally this question for the last couple of days, so the question doesn't go away. Juliana Gagliardi. A lot of academics have been engaged in framing Bolsonaro as a populist, but it seems that understanding him as a populist makes simple a very complex performance. Don't you think that observing him from his military reference makes the historical context receive the attention it deserves? In other words, do you think that starting the discussion from the idea of populism can still lead us somewhere? So, and then Romulo Ramos de Souza, joining us from Rio. I'd like to know if there is a part of the military that's really anti-Bolsonaro and that would help the Workers' Party, if it won, to diminish the current coup ideology within the armed forces. Well, okay, so far, when you talk about division within the military, it is either Bolsonaro or Moro. It doesn't seem to go beyond that. So he's asking if there can be further divisions. So I think now we can start with Natalia maybe, and then move on to Roberto and then Maud.
Okay.
And also, please make your final remarks if you want to say something else in this round.
Okay, Professor, thank you very much. I am now going to comment on the term and the concept of populism. I'm not a social scientist. Whatever you agree, I'm going to use in the in the articles I write later on. But I see that there's no agreement, so I'm not going to use it. I actually have an answer to the third question, which is something that is super interesting. The Brazilian army is very, very big. The Brazilian armed forces are the largest number of employees of the federal government, more than professors, more than anything else. And it is by now professionalized forces. There is a lot of people there. They think very differently. We're here talking about a group of the group of the top officials. But I've talked in my book, I'm going to show my book again, Dano Colateral. Dano Colateral, it's good for, people who are not specialists, just the general public. But they think very differently. They do not have, these ideas of the army as like being like tutoring the Republic or et cetera, et cetera. One interesting way to learn what they think is to follow the association of, lower ranks. They are active politically. They are trying to, earn better pay, stop, the complete difference that they are treated against the generals. And yes, there is a lot of unhappiness with the Bolsonaro government. So Agência Pública has published a bunch of interviews with the leaders of these unions. And there is a website that I follow and I really like following, which is called Revista Sociedade Militar. It is a militaristic website. It does have a lot of very good information from within the military, especially from within those ranks. And there is a lot of dissatisfaction, both with the generals, because of their own privileges, and also with the Bolsonaro government. And in general, apart from, the whole view of, the criminals should be killed and all of that is present, but they do have much more appreciation for democracy and criticize the role that the military is having in the government. So that's the two things that I would say. And the final remarks, thank you so much for listening to me. I'm very humbled that you read my book, Professor João, Professor Chalhoub, and Professor Mold. I'm going to send you one. Thank you very much. And I hope that this conversation continues because it is very relevant. And indeed, how, like Professor João said, whatever happens, the military are going to be a big component in the next presidency, with or without Bolsonaro, and Brazil will need to face it like it has not finished facing after the dictatorship.
Thank you, Natalia. This is great. So, João Roberto, let me just show João Roberto's book, the one that has been recently published, Os Militares e a Crise Brasileira. It's very good. It's a collection of essays, and it's really important to understand where we stand now. So, João Roberto, please.
Well, I don't have much to say after those last interventions, but I would say that, well, as I said, that it's very possible that we're going to have divisions next year. But it's interesting that Maud and I, we are maybe the ones that talked more about divisions in the armed forces. And I think that she agrees with me that in the last years, we did not see divisions. And the thing that's really important is that there was a unity in defending the military regime, in attacking the judiciary, in attacking politicians, and in always saying that the military are morally superior to the civilians. All of these are things that they had. We must keep in mind that Brazil had an army in the 50s and the beginning of the 60s that was very divided. And after the coup, they expelled anyone that was able to think critically. And the army in Brazil after that is really poor in critical thinking. I don't think that this is the army that we must have. We must have people that think and are able to criticize and are able to have ideas. And I don't see them. I really don't see. You see, Echegóin, for instance. I have listened to his interview to a radio in Rio Grande do Sul, Rádio Gaúcha, and I have tried to make an analysis of what he is saying. It's really unbelievable. He was saying that the Article 142 of the Constitution allows them to be the moderating power. And he said, I have talked in the weekend with very important people, with very important professors that told me that this is possible. There is only one guy that says that. That's the one who he talked with, Ives Gandra. And after that, the Supreme Court, justices said that this is not the correct interpretation of the article, and 700 people from professors of law said that this is not possible to understand this way. But there was a time that they did not speak much, and now that they speak, it's a complete deception. I can't believe what they're saying. It would be much better if they could keep silent, because I have some respect for them. And now what we hear now, it's unbelievable. How in the 2021 we can say things like that? That they asked Santos Cruz, was there a dictatorship in Brazil? He said, well, I don't know what's democracy and I don't know what's dictatorship. So this is the one that's the Democrat now. It's unbelievable. I hope there are people in the army, and most probably in the Navy and in the Air Force, the Navy, that are not agreeing with those things, but we don't know about that yet. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, João Roberto. It's just about the moderating power. Maybe these people should know that in the Constitution of 1824, there was a fourth power in the empire, the moderating power. There was a full chapter of the Constitution about it. there were books and books interpreting what the limits of the moderating power were and how it worked. It was not just a twisted interpretation of an article that creates a fourth power in the Republic. It's a lot of ignorance, as Roberto implied much more elegantly. Ignorance is my word, is also involved in what's going on. Notes book in Portuguese, because there is also a French and an English edition, A Política nos Quartéis. I recommend all these readings. These are the readings I've been doing the past few days, and I recommend all of them. So, Maud, your answers and final remarks, please.
Thank you for the publicity operation. A very good one. Just some words about the category of populism. It's interesting, Natalia, that you say that you're not going to answer because you're not a social scientist. And I talk every day, not every day, but very frequently to French journalists about this category. Because when I hear on the media, and that's very a frequent event, that there's going to be a fight between two populisms, Lula left-wing populism and Bolsonaro right-wing populism, I have big discussions with journalists, and that happens to be social science discussions. And the problem of populism, that it's a very fluctuant and weak scientific category that has has an interest to analyze the way you do politics, the way politicians in liberal democracies do politics. But without trying to enter in these debates, it's very interesting to see the political and mediatic uses of the categories. And it has a very specific use, that is to reject some political forces outside of the legitimate spectrum of democracy. And there is the insiders that have a certain relationship to the people, to the words, to their bodies, to many things, and the outsiders that don't have the same practices. And the main consequence is that it leads to forget fascism, authoritarian discourses, the fact that some forces, because they just deserve the title populism, you don't see that they are not democratic ones. So I think it's not a good category to think about and to reflect about extreme right, because it's a way to forget ideology and what is the position of these forces regarding to democracy. So there's many things to say about that, but I think that's a good argument to avoid the fact that to use this term to speak about extreme right and neo-fascism or fascism, as we can use to speak about Bolsonaro. Although fascism leads to many questions also to see if it's something in the past, or if you can use it to speak about extreme right. So about Ernesto's question, so we have spoke a lot about that in the last years. I see that some people saw what was happening, but the majority of us were seeing the authoritarians' practices and talkings of the military as a rock in the shoe of the Brazilian democracy. It was seen like that during, in particular, the National Truth Commission, something that was inconvenience, but not a threat. And I do believe that first, we are included in our social world. We didn't see what happened in the military, as we didn't see what happened in the society and in social worlds that were distant from us. And I always remember of something that happened in September 2018. It was the first presidential debate, the only one that included Bolsonaro. And at the moment, another literal candidate, the Caporal Daciolo, accused some of the other candidates to be part of the Latin American Socialist Union, a project of a Soviet Union in Latin America. And it became a joke in the social media. It was called Ursal. It evoked an ursu, a bear, and so everybody used it in their Facebook or Twitter page to make jokes and fun about these candidates, these literal candidates. And I think it was really a symbol on how parts of the progressive sectors were totally disconnected of the part of the population, because we know now that since 2014, there was more than 10 million members of Facebook, owners of Facebook pages that were part of anti-communist groups 4 years before the election of Bolsonaro. And we didn't see it. So we didn't see what happened in the army, but we didn't see what happened in the general society. Because maybe we academics and journalists and politicians are too far from many sectors and many popular sectors of the society, as well as the growing of religious fundamentalism were not perceived in its political consequences by us. We didn't see so many things. So we didn't see also what happened in the military. Another reason is that the armed institution is organized to be a black box, is organized to not be seen. It has an institutional discourse for the outside, and it's difficult to have access. And it's difficult to have access to who is in the game. As Natalia said, there is a specific generation, a specific group that at the moment decided that they earned more power and more centrality in the state. And having access to these people who have a project and who know that they have to hide their project to make it successful, it's very difficult. It's an institution that was built on the closure between the civilian world and themselves. So I don't think we have excuses. It's a failure, and we failed as an intellectual group to understand what was happening in the military, but as many sectors of the society supposed to understand it, failed in perceiving and have made a prediction on what was happening. But it's not specific on the military, and it's not specific on Brazil.
Thank you, Maud. I mean,
so last word, just to thank you, Sidney.
Okay.
It was a great pleasure, and I also would like to remain in contact with João Roberto. I'm in contact with João Roberto for the last 20 years, so I think we're going to remain in touch. But I would like to have more context, and I do believe that we need more interlocution between journalists and academics, because we're not doing exactly the same job, but we have lots in common and lots to share.
All right, thank you all for a wonderful panel. I liked that in the last part, we remembered UFSCar, the Union of the Socialist Republics of Latin America, and found out that it was not that much of a joke at all. But well, thank you very much. This is a wonderful panel, a lot to think about, and we need to continue the conversation. Thank you all who stayed with us until now, and see you in the next events of Dr. Class. Bye-bye.